Greetings, esteemed story seeker, as we embark on the voyage of Gasp of the Final Breath, crafted with the finesse and imagination of StoryWave.ai. Join our circle by liking, sharing, and subscribing for daily adventure delights. Chapter 1: The First Gift. The market square, usually a place of boisterous haggling and the earthy scent of fresh produce, was eerily silent. A thick fog clung to the cobblestones like a shroud. I'd come to purchase supplies for my bookstore, but the scene that unfolded before my eyes suggested today's list would include far more than paper and ink. "Kimberly, ye best not look," called Elijah Barnett, the constable, as he pushed through the gathering crowd. His deep voice carried a gravity I had never heard before. Yet curiosity compelled me, my feet moving of their own accord towards the source of the silence. At the heart of the marketplace, Mr. Thompson, the fishmonger, stood pallid and trembling beside his stall. His eyes were fixed on something on the ground, a hand. Not just any hand, but one severed at the wrist, its skin pale and lifeless. The silver ring on its finger gleamed mockingly, and the digits were splayed, as if offering up the empty air. The murmurs began as I approached, whispers of horror that danced on the wind, telling tales of others who had vanished without a trace. Their stories had been the fuel of idle gossip until now, but the gruesome spectacle before us made the rumors all too real. Someone or something was preying on Boston. I knelt beside the hand, my heart pounding against my chest. The silver ring was familiar, too familiar. It belonged to Sarah Caldwell, a local seamstress who hadn't been seen for days. Her absence, once a ripple of concern, now screamed of a sinister truth. "This is his work, isn't it?" "The Boston Carver," I said, my voice steady despite the dread that wrapped around me like a second skin. Elijah nodded solemnly, his blue eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of the fiend. "Aye, it's him, and he's taunting us, leaving his gifts." The marketplace erupted into chaos as the reality set in. The Boston Carver, a shadow that had lingered at the edge of our fears, had struck again, and with each victim, he seemed to grow bolder, more grotesque in his displays. But why here? Why now? These questions haunted me as I stood to face the onlookers, their faces etched with a terror that mirrored my own. I was the bookstore owner, the one who provided them with tales of far-off lands and fictional horrors, not someone who faced them in the flesh. The whispers grew louder, tales of the missing weaving through the crowd like a sinister thread. Sarah was just the latest in a string that seemed to have no end. And with each name mentioned, I felt a piece of our community's soul tear away. As the constable ushered the crowd back, I lingered, staring down at the severed hand. The market would close, the people would retreat to their homes, but the fear would remain, festering in the silence. And I knew, deep within my bones, that this was only the beginning. That night, I lay in my bed above the bookstore, listening to the sound of my own breath. The streets outside were quiet, but the darkness felt alive, as if the Boston Carver himself were prowling just beyond the reach of the lamplight. Sleep eluded me, chased away by the knowledge that the darkness hid more than just one man. It concealed our deepest fears, our unspoken truths. And as long as the Carver walked free, those shadows would never be lifted. I closed my eyes, the image of the hand seared into my memory. There would be no solace, no respite from the nightmare that had befallen our city. The first gift had been given, and I could not shake the feeling that it would not be the last. Chapter 2: Silent Streets, Echoed Screams. I was at my shop, surrounded by the familiar scent of aged paper and the soft rustle of turning pages when the clamor reached my ears. A second macabre act had painted our town with shades of fear so dark, the sun itself seemed hesitant to rise. Upon reaching the church, the sight that greeted us was one of pure, unadulterated horror. A head, severed with surgical precision, perched atop the stone steps leading to the hallowed entrance, its expression frozen in a silent scream. The eyes, wide and unseeing, bore into me, and I could not help but feel that they accused us all of our collective, helpless inaction. Elijah stood there, a sentinel amidst the chaos, his features etched with a tenacity that bordered on the fanatical. His blonde hair seemed to catch the light of the morning sun, a halo in the midst of the darkness that enveloped us. "We'll find this monster," he declared, his voice cutting through the whispers of the gathering crowd like a knife, "and we'll bring him to the gallows where he belongs." His assurance should have been a balm to the terrified townsfolk, yet the air was thick with suspicion. Murmurs of a curse upon the town began to spread like wildfire, and I watched as faces once familiar contorted with mistrust. Curse or no, this is the work of a man, Elijah continued, noting the anxious glances and murmurs. A man of flesh and blood, not some specter from the tales you tell your children. As the crowd dispersed, the murmurs did not cease but grew in fervor, now laced with hints of deeper corruption. The constabulary, once trusted to protect and serve, now found themselves the subjects of scrutiny. Quiet voices spoke of bribery, of ineptitude, of a darkness within that matched the horrors without. I returned to my shop, the air somehow heavier than before. The laughter and light-hearted banter that once filled the square were now as absent as the victims of this unseen terror. Each step felt like a descent into a story of my own making, one where the ending had yet to be written, and the villain remained shrouded in mystery. As twilight approached, Elijah entered my store, the bell above the door announcing his presence like a herald of more somber times. His face, usually the embodiment of stoicism, bore the weight of his task. "Kim," he began, his voice low, "the people are scared, and when fear takes hold, reason often falls by the wayside." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "They speak of curses and corruption, Eli. They fear the Carver is but a symptom of a greater ailment." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Aye, and it's up to us to prove them wrong. We must stand as beacons of hope, lest we succumb to the very darkness we seek to vanquish." We conversed long into the night, discussing the possible connections between the killings and the whispered rumors that seemed as deadly as the blade of the Boston Carver. It was a game of shadows and half-truths, one that we were ill-prepared to play. Elijah's determination was a fortress in the midst of our doubt, yet even he could not shield us from the gnawing fear that perhaps the Carver was but one piece of a much larger, more insidious puzzle. As the night deepened and the streets emptied, the echoes of our discussion lingered in the air. Boston lay in the grip of an unrelenting terror, and as I finally succumbed to a restless sleep, I knew that our silent streets would carry the screams of our anguish far into the foreboding darkness that awaited us. Chapter 3: Pages of Tranquility. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that once heralded the arrival of knowledge seekers, now a prelude of unease. He entered, a peculiar man, cloaked in anonymity, his presence a vivid incongruity to the regular patrons who sought the comfort of literary escapism. His eyes, the color of storm clouds about to burst, scanned the shelves with an intensity that belied a purpose I could not fathom. I watched him, curiosity piqued, as he meandered through the aisles, fingers trailing over the spines, with a reverence reserved for the sacred. "May I assist you in finding a particular volume?" I ventured, my tone steady though my pulse quickened with apprehension. He turned, his gaze piercing, and offered a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I am but a sojourner in the realm of words, dear lady," he replied, his voice a melodic cadence that masked an accent I could not place. "Perhaps you could recommend a tome to occupy my thoughts?" I suggested several titles, watching as he perused each with a critic's eye before selecting a collection of local lore and legends, a book that spoke of the very darkness that now held Boston in its icy grasp. He made his way to a secluded corner of the shop, and there, under the watchful gaze of literary giants, he consumed the pages with a voraciousness that was almost palpable. Hours passed, the shop's usual bustle subdued, as if the very air was holding its breath. When he finally approached the counter to make his purchase, I noticed his fingers stained with ink, carefully placed the book down, a folded piece of paper marking a page within. With a curt nod, he departed, leaving behind a silence that seemed to echo with the weight of his presence. It was only after the door had closed, the chime a faint reminder of his visit, that I unfolded the paper he had left. A symbol, intricate and unfamiliar, was drawn upon it with meticulous care, a circle ensnared by thorny vines, with a singular unblinking eye at its center. It was a mark I had never seen before, one that seemed to pulse with an intent I could not decipher. My curiosity, now a living, breathing entity, urged me to delve into the depths of the book he had touched. There, amidst tales of specters and curses, I found a passage marked by the very symbol he had drawn. It spoke of an ancient evil, a shadow that fed on fear and reveled in the corruption of innocence. As the evening waned, I pored over every account, every folktale that might shed light on the symbol's meaning. The bookstore, my haven of tranquility, had become a study of the macabre, the walls lined with silent witnesses to my search for truth. Elijah entered, his arrival unheralded by the bell now silent in the stillness. He found me amidst a fortress of open volumes, my eyes wide with the hunger for knowledge that had consumed me. "Kim, what's happened? You look as though you've seen a ghost," he remarked, concern etched into his rugged features. I showed him the symbol, watched as his brow furrowed, the depths of his blue eyes clouding with uncertainty. "I've never seen the likes of this before," he confessed, "but it reeks of menace." Together, we speculated on its origins, on its connection to the Carver, whose very existence had become a scramble of rumor and conjecture. Each theory we spun seemed more fantastical than the last, yet we could not deny the palpable sense of foreboding that clung to the symbol like a shroud. The night grew heavy around us, the bookstore a vessel adrift in a sea of shadows. Our conversation, once a spirited exchange of ideas, dwindled to whispers that seemed too loud in the encompassing darkness. As Elijah took his leave, I remained, the symbol before me a taunting enigma. Boston's heartbeat was an erratic rhythm of fear and suspicion, and I knew that somewhere, in the depths of the night, the Carver was listening, drawing strength from our terror. The pages of tranquility had been turned, and the dark shadow that loomed over my peaceful existence was inching ever closer, its intentions as unreadable as the symbol that now haunted my every thought. Chapter 4: Whispers in the Dark. The cloak of night had descended upon Boston with an unsettling eagerness, as if the darkness itself was complicit in the horrors that stalked its alleys and back streets. My journey home from the bookstore was a path I had tread countless times, yet now each shadow seemed to harbor the potential for malice, and every flicker of movement was a specter dancing at the periphery of my vision. The air was thick with the briny tang of the harbor, mingling with the less savory odors that evening tides would carry. Lamps sputtered in the grip of a biting wind, their light offering scant protection against the growing sense of dread that wound its way around me like ivy. It was then, in the tyrannical silence of an alleyway, that I perceived the unmistakable sensation of being watched. A figure stood motionless, shrouded in the embrace of shadow, its gaze fixed upon me with an intensity that seemed to reach out and brush my skin with icy fingers. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickened my pace, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The figure matched my strides with a predatory grace, a specter gliding through the darkness. A stumble over an unseen cobblestone sent me sprawling to the ground, my hands scraping against the unforgiving stone. I felt the warmth of blood as it welled from the abrasions, a stark reminder of my vulnerability. Scrambling to my feet, I fled, the sound of my pursuer's footsteps a relentless echo in my ears. The once familiar streets twisted into a labyrinth of fear, where every turn might lead to my undoing. By some stroke of providence, I emerged onto a broader avenue, the figure lost in the labyrinthine twists behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I leaned against the cool facade of a building, my senses reeling from the narrow escape. The wounds upon my palms throbbed with each beat of my pulse, a reminder that the hunter and the hunted were never far apart in this game of shadows. Later, within the sanctuary of my home, I recounted the harrowing encounter to Elijah, his visage a mask of concern and frustration. "I've been combing through records, talking to folks," he confided, his voice a low rumble of contained anger. "There are leads, hints of something bigger at play, but every time I get close, I'm met with walls where there should be doors." I watched as he paced, the floorboards creaking under his determined stride. "I'm being stonewalled, Kim. My own superiors are holding back, and I can't fathom why." I shared with him the symbol I had unearthed, the eye within the thorns, and watched as recognition flickered across his features. "I've seen this," he murmured, etched into the doorway of an abandoned warehouse by the docks. Our conversation stretched into the early hours, our words a ragbag of theories and speculation, each thread intertwining with the next to form a picture we could not yet see in its entirety. Yet, the fear that had taken root within me refused to be dislodged by mere discourse. I was being hunted. Of that I was certain, and the dark figure that had watched from the shadows was but one manifestation of the evil that sought to claim me. As Elijah departed, the weight of our unsolved mysteries seemed to press upon the very walls of my home. The whispers in the dark were growing louder, their sinister sibilance a promise of the terror yet to come. Lying in bed, my wounds dressed but still aching, I listened to the night. The gentle hush was no comfort, for within it lurked the quiet footfalls of my shadowy pursuer, the harbinger of the Boston Carver's unspeakable intentions. Boston's heart beat with a terror that was palpable, its rhythm syncopated by the footsteps of a killer and the stifled cries of its citizens. And amidst it all I lay, ensnared in a web of dread, wondering when the darkness would next reach out to claim me. Chapter 5. Butcher's Bill. A pall had been cast over Boston, a shroud of fear that had settled in the wake of the Carver's grim harvest. The streets, once thronged with life, now whispered with the secrets of the slain, and the air hung heavy with a silence that seemed to watch and wait with bated breath. The day was overcast, the sky a canvas of steely grays, as if even the heavens mourned the loss of innocence in our once bustling town. I made my way through the market, the vendors' calls subdued, their usual vibrancy dampened by the shadow that loomed over us all. My errand was one of necessity, a trip to the local butcher for the cuts that would sustain me through the week. The butcher, Mr. Clayton, had been a fixture in our community for years, his robust laughter a counterpoint to the cleaver's rhythmic fall upon the chopping block. As I approached his shop, the absence of that familiar sound sent a chill down my spine. The wooden door, normally propped open to welcome patrons, was closed, an ominous sentinel that seemed to guard the secrets within. My hand hesitated at the latch, a sense of foreboding coiling within me. It was then that the door swung open, and Elijah emerged, his face a mask of grim determination. "Kim, you shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low timbre that carried the weight of unspeakable truths. "I came for provisions," I replied, my gaze straying past him to the interior of the shop, where the air was tinged with the metallic scent of blood. "It's Clayton," he said, his words heavy with sorrow. "He's been taken from us, and not peacefully." The news landed like a blow, the realization that the Carver had struck again, and this time so close to the heart of our community. Mr. Clayton, the amiable butcher, whose hands had always been stained with the blood of livestock, now lay in the same visceral repose as his wares. "How?" I asked, though I wasn't certain I wished to know the answer. With a precision that's become all too familiar, Elijah responded, his eyes dark with the horror of it all. "He was found this morning, arrayed like a grotesque sculpture in his own display window." The very thought sent a shiver coursing through me, the image of the butcher, once so full of life, now reduced to a mere component in the Carver's sickening tableau. As I turned to leave, my mind reeled with the implications of this latest atrocity. Boston was unraveling, the fabric of our society cut to ribbons by the blade of an unseen menace. Later, in the confines of my bookstore, I sought to distract myself with research into the symbol that had become an obsession. The pages of history whispered of cults and secret societies, of symbols that bore the power to summon and to bind. It was amidst the stacks that I was found by Mrs. Aldridge, a widow whose thirst for mystery novels was eclipsed only by her propensity for town gossip. "Such a terrible thing about poor Mr. Clayton," she murmured, her voice a tremulous hum that filled the quiet between the shelves. "Yes, it's a shock to us all," I agreed, my hands absent-mindedly straightening the stacks as I spoke. "They say he was involved in something nefarious," she continued, her eyes wide with the thrill of scandal. "A cult, some say, long forgotten, but perhaps not gone." I paused, the coincidence too great to ignore. "A cult," I echoed, my interest piqued despite the chill that danced along my spine. Mrs. Aldridge leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Yes, dear. They speak of rituals and symbols, of a darkness that was once driven out, but has now returned to claim its due." Our conversation stretched on, a dance of questions and half-answers that wove a conglomerate of suspicion and fear. The symbol, the deaths, the whispers of a cult, all seemed to intertwine in a pattern too intricate to be mere chance. The day waned, and the shop grew dim with the approaching dusk. Mrs. Aldridge took her leave, her words lingering in the air like the remnants of a forgotten incantation. I was left alone with my thoughts, the symbol etched into my mind like a brand. The carver's work was not the frenzy of a madman, but the calculated strokes of an artist painting in the medium of death. As night fell and the streets of Boston emptied, I sat in the silence of my shop, the symbol before me, a memorial to the darkness that had seeped into the marrow of our town. The butcher's bill had come due, and with it the realization that the price might be more than any of us were prepared to pay. Chapter 6: A Town Held Captive. The dread that had crept into Boston's bones now held the city in a vice-like grip, the fear palpable as a thick fog rolling in from the harbor. Shopkeepers, once the sentinels of commerce, were seen nailing boards over windows as twilight threatened, while the streets, those arteries of urban life, lay abandoned, the heartbeat of the city stuttering into silence. In this new, unwelcome reality, whispered theories traded hands more often than coins, each rumor more chilling than the last. I, Kimberly, walked the desolate streets, the echo of my own footsteps, a stark reminder that the conglomerate of our community was fraying at the edges. The latest victim, a seamstress named Abigail, whose nimble fingers had once danced with the grace of a puppeteer, was now the central figure in a grotesque tableau. She was found in her shop, stitched into the very fabric of her unfinished conglomerate, her life's work and her death's display entwined in a sickening parody of artistry. Elijah met me at the scene, the furrows in his brow deepening with each new revelation. "It's a message," he said, his voice rough with the frustration and fatigue that had become his constant companions. "The killer is weaving a narrative with the blood of our kin." I shuddered at the thought, the seamstress's fate a grim chapter in a story I wished I could unread. "But to what end?" I asked, struggling to make sense of the senseless. "That's what we need to figure out," he replied, pulling from his coat a sheaf of papers, notes scrawled in a hand driven by obsession. "There's a pattern here, something deliberate in the madness." We retreated to my bookstore, the only place where the whispers of the outside world were drowned out by the quiet wisdom of the volumes that lined the shelves. There, amidst the musty scent of leather and parchment, we pored over Elijah's findings. The pattern emerged slowly, a constellation of sinister design. Each victim had been chosen for their craft, their artistry turned against them in death. The symbols, the locations, the timing, it all pointed to a larger design, a patchwork of terror that the killer was meticulously crafting. "The carver is not just killing at random," Elijah mused, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's selecting his victims to create something." But what? Our exchange grew more fervent as we debated possibilities, each theory more harrowing than the last. The walls of my shop seemed to close in around us, the tomes that surrounded us silent sentinels to our desperate search for answers. The conversation grew long, winding like the labyrinthine streets outside, until the lines between conjecture and revelation blurred. We were two souls caught in the web of a madman's design, seeking a thread that would lead us out of the darkness. As the night waned and Elijah took his leave, the weight of our discoveries lay heavy upon my shoulders. The shop, once my haven, now felt like a cell, the books mere bars that held me captive to the encroaching terror. Lying in bed, the silence of the night was oppressive, the absence of sound more haunting than the furor of dread that had become our daily refrain. Each creak of the old building, each whisper of wind against the window pane seemed to carry the breath of the carver, his presence as inescapable as the darkness that shrouded our town. Boston, the city I had known and loved, was now a town held captive by the specter of fear. And as I drifted into the uneasy embrace of sleep, I knew that we were all bound to the carver's blade, pawns in a game that we were only beginning to comprehend. Chapter 7: Echoes of the Past. The past clings to Boston like the ivy to its storied brickwork, each tendril a sinew of history that refuses to be forgotten. In the pursuit of understanding the present terror, I found myself delving into the memoirs of the city's past, where the ink of history had dried upon pages yellowed with age. The town records, a collection of births, deaths, and everything betwixt, were a repository of life's ebb and flow through the centuries. Amidst the dust and decay of the archive, I uncovered a chilling pattern, a legacy of violence that wove through the years like a dark thread. Elijah had joined me in this foray into antiquity, his presence a steady counterpoint to the chill that danced up my spine as I read. "Look here," I said, my finger tracing the lines of an aged ledger. "Every third generation, the town is beset by tragedy. Fires, disappearances, unexplained deaths." He leaned over my shoulder, his breath a warm contrast to the cool air of the archives. "It's like clockwork," he murmured, his tone laced with disbelief. Indeed, it was as though some malevolent force awoke with the turning of the decades, each emergence marked by a series of horrors that echoed the violence of the present. Our current plight seemed less like a series of isolated incidents and more like the latest refrain of a haunting, ancient melody. As we pored over the records, a missive arrived, slid under the door of the archive by unseen hands. It bore no signature, no mark of identification, but its contents cast a shadow deeper than the dim light of the room. The letter suggested a cover-up, a conspiracy within the police department that ran as deep and as dark as the history we had unearthed. "They're hiding something, Kim," Elijah said, his voice tight with the anger of betrayal. "And whatever it is, it's tied to the Carver." Our conversation then turned to soft-spoken words, a discourse of suspicions and theories that wove around us, like the cobwebs that adorned the corners of the room. Each word spoken was a piece of a puzzle that refused to be solved, a mystery that deepened with every connection drawn. The town's history, the Carver's deeds, the symbols that bore an uncanny resemblance to those etched into the very foundations of Boston, they all pointed to a horrifying conclusion. We were not merely grappling with the actions of a lone madman, but with the resurgence of an evil that had sunk its roots deep into the soil of the city. The silence of the archive was a heavy cloak around us, the whispers of the past as loud as shouts in the stillness. We were surrounded by the echoes of lives long since past, each one a confirmation to the cyclical nature of the darkness that now held us in its grip. As we left the archive, the heaviness of the room lifted, but the weight of our discoveries did not. The streets outside, now bathed in the golden hues of sunset, seemed to watch us with 1,000 unseen eyes, the city itself a silent observer to the unfolding drama. That night, as I lay in bed, the records and the anonymous letter replayed in my mind, a litany of dread that promised no respite. The connection between past and present had been drawn in a line of blood that seemed destined to continue its spill. And somewhere, in the shadowed recesses of Boston, the Carver was no doubt planning his next masterpiece, a continuation of a legacy that had claimed the city as its canvas. The echoes of the past were not just whispers, they were screams that had yet to be silenced. Chapter 8. Decay. Boston, once a proud patchwork of colonial elasticity and burgeoning progress, now frayed at the edges, its vibrant threads unraveling into despair. The very soul of the city seemed to wither under the specter of the Carver's shadow, a blight upon the cobblestone streets and the hearts of its inhabitants. The town hall, a stately edifice that had withstood the test of time and revolution, played host to a gathering of citizens whose faces were maps of worry and suspicion. I, Kimberly, stood among them, my own countenance surely reflecting the same distress. Trust, that once unspoken bond that held our community together, now lay as tattered as the posters that adorned the notice boards, their messages of hope lost among warnings and pleas. Elijah had convened the meeting, his grit to bring order a warning in the growing murk of fear. "Friends," he began, his voice a clarion amidst the murmurs, "we must stand united, lest we crumble under the weight of our own dread." His plea was met with nods and mutters of agreement, a fragile consensus teetering on the edge of conviction. But as he reached for the gavel to punctuate the start of proceedings, a collective gasp cut through the air like the winter's chill through threadbare cloaks. A hand, lifeless and pale as the underbelly of a fish, lay upon the podium, its fingers curled around the wooden mallet as if in a gruesome parody of authority. The room erupted, a chatter of horror and outrage that shook the very foundations of the hall. Neighbors turned upon one another, casting aspersions with pointed fingers, their trust eroded like the stone steps worn by centuries of footfalls. Silence. Elijah's command sliced through the pandemonium, restoring a semblance of order to the chaos. "This This is his work. We must not let it divide us. I watched him, his athletic frame set against the mass of frenzied townsfolk, a rock in a tempestuous sea. We must remember who the true enemy is, he continued, his blue eyes scanning the crowd, seeking out the flickers of reason that remained. The meeting adjourned with nothing resolved, the air still thick with the taint of suspicion. Elijah approached me, his demeanor grave. I found the symbol Kim at the scene. His voice was barely a whisper, meant for my ears alone. The same symbol from my book, the one that had become the centerpiece of my waking nightmares. At the scene, I echoed, my mind reeling. He nodded, pulling a scrap of paper from his pocket. Upon it was the familiar circle, thorns, and unblinking eye. It was etched into the doorframe, just out of sight. This cult, whatever it is, they're involved. Our exchange was a duet of hushed urgency, each revelation another twist in the knot that tightened around the city's throat. The symbol was no longer a mere curiosity. It was a sigil of intent, a mark that bound the carver's work to something far more ancient and sinister. The evening air was a cold caress as I made my way home, the streets deserted and watchful. The town hall's discord had spilled out into the night, infecting Boston with a renewed sense of dread. Friends and neighbors, once the bedrock of society, now viewed each other with the jaundiced eye of suspicion. Behind closed doors, the carver's message was becoming clearer. Each grim gift a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled, would reveal a patchwork of malice and intent. The decay was not just of the body, but of the very spirit that once held us together. And as I retired to the uneasy sanctuary of my bed, I knew that the rot had set in deeper than any of us had feared. The carver, a specter of violence and horror, had not merely infiltrated the city, he had claimed it, his signature etched into the very bones of Boston. And I, caught in the web of his design, could only wait and watch as the next piece of his macabre plan fell into place. Chapter 9. Shadows of Doubt. A thick fog clung to the cobblestones of Boston like a shroud, the damp tendrils reaching out as if to grasp at the ankles of the few who dared traverse the streets at this late hour. The mist served as a fitting metaphor for the investigation that Elijah and I found ourselves mired in. With each step forward, the clarity we sought seemed to slip further away, obscured by more questions than answers. Elijah's silhouette was barely discernible a few paces ahead, his broad shoulders hunched against the chill that no coat could ward off. Our breaths materialized in the air, ghostly apparitions that faded as quickly as they appeared. We were on our way to investigate what had been heralded as a promising lead, but my intuition gnawed at me with the persistence of a starved rodent. "This could be it, Kim," Elijah said, his words a muted rumble beneath the cloak of fog. "The break we've been grasping for." I nodded, the knot of apprehension in my stomach tightening. "Or another one of his games," I replied, the skepticism in my voice a thin veneer over the trepidation that underpinned it. The address led us to an abandoned warehouse by the docks, a skeletal structure that loomed out of the fog like a forecaster of despair. Its windows were dark, soulless eyes, and the doors hung off their hinges, gaping maws inviting us into the bowels of uncertainty. Elijah stepped inside first, his lantern casting an orb of light that fought bravely against the crushing darkness. We navigated a labyrinth of crates and discarded ropes, the silence so complete that it seemed to swallow the echo of our steps. "Here," he said, gesturing to an aged crate that bore the symbol we had come to know so well, the circle ensnared by thorns, with the singular, unblinking eye at its center. As he reached out to examine it, a sharp crack split the air, and the floor beneath him gave way. I lunged forward, my hands closing on empty air as Elijah disappeared into the darkness below with a pained shout that was abruptly silenced. "Elijah!" My voice was a raw blade, cutting through the silence that rushed back in like the tide. Panic clawed at my chest as I dropped to my knees at the edge of the gaping hole that had swallowed him whole. After a heart-stopping moment, his voice drifted up to me, strained but alive. "I'm all right," he called out, though the pain was evident in the tightness of his words. "It's not deep, but be wary, it was a trap." My relief was tempered by the cold realization that we had walked right into the carver's snare. The warehouse, the lead, it had all been an elaborate ruse, a maze constructed for his twisted amusement. I carefully made my way down to Elijah, finding him amongst the rubble with a grimace etched across his features. His leg was injured, a dark stain spreading across the fabric of his trousers. As I helped him to his feet, the gravity of our situation settled upon us like the dust that rose in clouds around us. "He's playing with us," Elijah gritted out, leaning heavily on my shoulder. "And he's always 2 steps ahead." The journey back to the safety of the street was a trial, each step an indication to Elijah's fortitude and the growing dread that clawed at my mind. We were pawns in a game that twisted and turned with the Carver's whims, and the notion of victory seemed as distant as the stars veiled by the night's gloom. Once we were safely ensconced in the warmth of the local apothecary, tending to Elijah's wound, his voice lowered to a whisper, tinged with suspicion. I can't shake the feeling that someone is feeding him information, keeping him 1 step ahead of us. I met his gaze, seeing the flicker of doubt that danced in his eyes. "You think it's someone from the constabulary?" I asked, the words tasting like bile upon my tongue. He nodded, the lines of his face hardening. "I do. There's rot at the heart of our ranks, and it's aiding him." The conversation that followed was a tangle of conjecture and whispered fears, our words intertwining like the threads of a noose. Trust, already a scarce commodity, had become as valuable and as dangerous as gunpowder. As I left Elijah to rest, the night seemed to press in around me, the shadows whispering of doubt and deceit. The killer's true intentions remained hidden, cloaked in a darkness that no light seemed capable of piercing. The streets of Boston, once my home, now seemed like a prison, the very air charged with the Carver's malice. As I walked through the fog, the weight of his unseen gaze was a tangible force, a reminder that although we hunted him, we too were being hunted. And so, as I finally sought the solace of my own bed, the echoes of our thwarted lead and the specter of betrayal played a relentless refrain in my mind. The shadows of doubt had been cast, and within their murky depths, the Carver's laughter seemed to resonate, a sound without mirth that promised more suffering to come. Chapter 10. The Scent of Fear. Boston's night air had turned foul, a miasma of fear so potent it seemed to emanate from the very cobblestones that lined the streets. The moon, a pale specter in an otherwise starless sky, provided scant illumination, casting ghostly shadows that danced with my every step. The echo of my boots against the stone was a lonely sound in the authoritarian silence that had fallen over the city. I, Kimberly, tread carefully, each whisper of wind causing me to start, each creak of the aging buildings a signal to my frayed nerves. The Carver's presence was a tangible thing, a cloak of malice that wrapped around the city, suffocating it with dread. The scent of him was in the air, that coppery tang of spilled lifeblood mixed with something fouler, something that spoke of decay and the grave. It was the smell of terror, and it followed me, clung to me, a relentless reminder that nowhere was safe, not while he was still out there. My breaths came in quivering gasps as I hastened my pace, the weight of Elijah's revolver cold and reassuring in the pocket of my coat. I had taken to carrying it, a heavy but necessary burden, for the lines between reality and the paranoia that gripped me had blurred into obscurity. A rustle, a shadow moving against the darkness, and my heart seized. I caught only glimpses, a silhouette that seemed more wraith than man, slipping between the alleys and disappearing into the night. I pressed myself against the cold brick of a nearby building, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. "Elijah?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, hoping against hope that it was him, that he had come to find me. But there was no answer, only the sound of my own frantic heartbeat thudding in my ears. It was then, amidst the silent dance of fear and shadow, that revelation struck. The symbol, circle, thorns, and it wasn't just a mark of terror. It was something older, a sigil of ritualistic intent. The breakthrough had come earlier that day, tucked away in the dusty corner of the library's occult section. A tome, ancient and bound in leather that whispered of forbidden knowledge, had fallen open to a page that bore the symbol and spoke of rituals, of blood sacrifices made to forgotten gods in exchange for power, for immortality. "Elijah," I had said, showing him the passage, "this could be what we're looking for, a motive steeped in ritual and old beliefs." His face, usually a mask of stoic resolve, had faltered. "Then we're not just dealing with a murderer," he'd replied. the gravity of our situation reflected in his deep blue gaze. We're dealing with a fanatic, someone trying to invoke something. Our exchange had been a marathon of theories, each more unsettling than the last. The Carver was no longer a mere specter haunting the streets. He was an acolyte performing a series of dark rites, and we were all unwitting participants in his diabolical liturgy. Now, as I stood alone in the darkness, the memory of our conversation played over in my mind, a chilling prelude to the encounter I had just narrowly escaped. I returned home, the door locking behind me with a finality that seemed almost hopeful. Home was my fortress, my bastion against the night and its horrors. Yet as I ascended the stairs to my room, the scent of fear still clung to me, a reminder that walls and locks could not keep out the darkness that had taken root in the city. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, as if it might reveal the answers we sought. The silhouette of the Carver, the scent of blood, the revelations of the tome, they swirled in my mind, pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, would unveil the true nature of the evil that stalked us. Sleep was a stranger that night, and as dawn's first light began to seep through the curtains, the weight of our plight settled upon me. We were locked in a descent into chaos, the Carver's unresolved symphony playing out with each life he claimed. And as the city awoke to another day under his shadow, I knew that the scent of fear would linger, a perfume of death that marked us all, a signal to the Carver that his ritual was far from complete. Chapter 11. Cracks in the Facade. An air of desolation clung to the early morning streets of Boston, thick as the fog rolling in from the harbor. The once solid edifice of our community, built on trust and fellowship, now showed the hairline fractures of a society on the brink of collapse. Elijah and I walked side by side, two solitary figures amidst a city of onlookers, our former allies now regarding us with thinly veiled suspicion. The town square, which had long been a hub of commerce and conviviality, had transformed overnight into a macabre stage. Councilman O'Reilly, a man whose ruddy face and boisterous laugh had been as familiar as the cobblestones beneath our feet, now hung lifeless from the grand oak that stood as a silent sentinel at the square's heart. The grisly scene was not just a message, it was a declaration. The real Carver was still at large. Elijah's face, usually a bastion of resolve, was etched with the weariness that came from too many sleepless nights spent chasing shadows. "They thought it was him," he muttered, his eyes not leaving the grim visage of O'Reilly's final torment. "They thought he was the Carver." The murmurs of the crowd were a discordant symphony of fear and speculation. The councilman's hands were bound, his lifeless body a grotesque puppet in the Carver's cruel performance, his end serving as the killer's perverse vindication. I felt the gazes of the townsfolk upon us, their eyes like daggers of doubt cast in our direction. The paranoia that had seeped into the very mortar of Boston's foundations was now a gale force, tearing at the remnants of camaraderie that had once bound us together. "Kimberly," Elijah said, turning to me, his voice a low thrum that carried an undertone of urgency. "The force is split. There are those who believe we're hunting a ghost, and others convinced the Carver is one of our own." The revelation was a gut punch, the taste of betrayal bitter on my tongue. "Within the police?" I asked, the question of viper that coiled in my stomach. He nodded gravely. "Aye, and it's tearing us apart." Our exchange was a tightrope walk of conjecture and revelation, each word a step taken over an abyss of uncertainty. "We need to stand firm, Elijah," I insisted, my voice steady despite the tumult around us. "If we falter now, the Carver wins." He agreed, his affirmation a silent vow made amidst the chaos that had claimed our city. As the day waned and the shadows grew long, the town square slowly emptied, leaving behind the specter of O'Reilly's demise as a grim reminder of the Carver's reach. Elijah and I retreated to my bookstore, where the walls lined with literature seemed to offer the faintest whisper of solace. "We're on our own, Kim," he confided as we sat amongst the silent tomes. "The higher-ups are circling the wagons, and I'm no longer certain who I can trust." I understood all too well. The solitude that enveloped us was not just physical, it was a barrier forged from the mistrust that now ran rampant through the veins of Boston. Yet as we sat there, the gears of my mind churned with relentless determination. "We will unravel this, Elijah," I said, the promise one I made not just to him, but to myself. The carver is human, fallible. He'll slip, and we'll be there when he does. Our conversation stretched into the evening, an aggregate woven from the threads of our shared resolve. Each theory, each scrap of evidence was a piece of the puzzle we were desperate to solve. The night crept upon us, a shroud that blanketed the city in darkness, but within the walls of my shop, a faint light of hope flickered. Despite the decay that threatened to consume us, we would persevere, for the alternative was to succumb to the carver's twisted vision. As Elijah departed, the solitude of the bookstore closed in around me. The scent of aging paper was a heady perfume that mingled with the lingering traces of fear that clung to my clothes. The descent into chaos seemed inevitable, but within me, a fire had been kindled, a fire that would burn through the shadows of doubt and illuminate the truth of the carver's identity. Lying awake in the stillness of my room, I clung to the notion that purpose would guide us through the darkness. The carver had taken much from us, but he could not take our will to fight, to uncover the cracks in his facade and expose him to the light of justice. Chapter 12, The Gallows Grow. I found myself wandering the streets, the cobblestones slick with the mist that rose from the river, the very earth weeping for the souls lost to the carver's blade. The townspeople eyed me with a mixture of fear and expectation, their faces haggard with the sleepless nights that had become our shared inheritance. Elijah, his face drawn and pale beneath the brim of his hat, met me at the steps of the courthouse. "They're restless, Kimberly," he said, his voice barely carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "They want answers, solutions we can't give them. Every lead we've followed has turned to dust." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. Our every effort seemed to be met with more questions, the carver always one step ahead, eluding capture with a deftness that bordered on the supernatural. As we turned to leave, a shout rang out, a forerunner of chaos. "He's here! The carver's here!" The crowd surged like a wave, panic and anger clashing in a storm of human desperation. We pushed through the throng, our hearts pounding in unison with the frantic beat of a town on the brink of madness. The alleyway where the shout had originated was empty, save for the lingering miasma of fear. It was then that the betrayal struck, swift and brutal. Elijah's cry of pain was a blade to my soul as he crumpled to the ground, a dark figure slipping away into the shadows. My hands were on him in moments, tearing at his coat to reveal the crimson that blossomed across his shirt. "Hold on, Elijah," I pleaded, my voice a desperate whisper as I pressed against the wound. The warmth of his blood, a stark counterpoint to the cold that seeped into my bones. His eyes met mine, the trust within them clear even as the light began to fade. "Kimberly," he gasped, "it's one of our own." I saw the badge. Adrenaline lent me strength, and I hoisted him into my arms, carrying him back towards the main thoroughfare, the murmurs of the crowd growing distant behind us. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. Someone within the constabulary was the carver, or at the very least, his accomplice. We made it back to the apothecary, where I laid him down with shaking hands, the chemist rushing to our aid with bandages and a grim determination etched upon his brow. As Elijah's breathing steadied, the realization of our plight settled upon us like the dust that covered the shop's shelves. The killer was not just among us, he was one of us. The implications were as chilling as the wind that howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames. Later, as I sat beside Elijah, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the fire within me burned brighter than the one that crackled in the hearth. The evidence was there, scattered like breadcrumbs through the dark forest of our investigation, reports that didn't add up, sightings that led nowhere, warnings that came too late. Elijah stirred, his hand finding mine, his grip weak but present. "We'll get him, Kim," he murmured, his voice a raspy shadow of its former authority. "We have to." I squeezed his hand in response, the gesture a silent pact made in the dim light of the apothecary's back room. Our trust in each other was our last bastion against the darkness that threatened to engulf us, the only certainty we had left in a world where the gallows grew with each passing day. The killer was close, closer than we had ever imagined, and as I watched over Elijah, the pieces of the puzzle began to coalesce into a picture that was as terrifying as it was clear. We were not just hunting a murderer, we were hunting a monster masquerading in the skin of a man. and the scent of fear that he left in his wake would be his downfall. Chapter 13, Bait and Switch. The town square, festooned with garlands of reds and golds, swelled with people. The air was filled with the sound of a fiddler, the laughter of children, and the rich aroma of roasted meats and sweet pastries. Yet beneath this veneer of festivity, a collective breath was held, eyes darting to shadows, waiting for the horror we were sure would strike. Elijah, his wound now a dull ache beneath his coat, leaned close to share his thoughts amidst the din. "It's today, Kim. The pattern is clear. He'll use the cover of the crowd, the distraction of the celebration." I nodded, my hand resting on the revolver hidden in the folds of my skirt. "And we'll be ready." "Today it ends," I affirmed, though a whisper of doubt lingered like the morning's last wisp of fog. But as the day wore on, the sun arcing its way through the azure sky, the expected pattern broke. No screams shattered the air, no blood stained the cobblestones. The celebration, against all odds, passed without incident. The relief was palpable, a tangible sigh that swept through the crowd as evening approached, and the fiddler's tune wound down to a contented hum. The disarray this unexpected piece threw our investigation into was a maelstrom of confusion. We had prepared for a climax, for closure, but were instead met with anticlimax, the absence of horror. As the townsfolk dispersed, their joy unmarred by tragedy, Elijah's gaze met mine, a storm of questions brewing in his eyes. "What does it mean, Kim? Why today? Why break the cycle?" We retreated to the quiet of my bookstore, the lingering scent of festivities drifting through the streets behind us. The walls of my sanctuary, lined with the wisdom of generations, offered no solace to our bewilderment. It was only as the last of the revelers made their way home, the night drawing its cloak around the town, that the other shoe dropped. A local boy, breathless with the urgency of his news, burst through my door. "Miss Grafton, Constable Barnett, you need to see this," he gasped, his young face alight with a mix of fear and excitement. We followed him to the outskirts of the square, to a scene that had been overlooked in the day's merriment, an old, disused well, long boarded over and forgotten by most. The boy pointed to something that made my heart seize, a fresh mark upon the wood, the symbol we knew too well, the eye within the thorns. "It wasn't there yesterday," the boy insisted, his words tumbling out. "I play here often. It's new, I swear it." Elijah knelt by the well, his fingers tracing the symbol. He was here, Kim. Amidst the laughter and the dancing, he was here. The realization that the carver had been amongst us, a specter at the feast, sent a shiver through me. His plan was larger than any of us had realized, his absence not a sign of defeat, but of a deeper, more insidious intent. "The bait and switch," I murmured, the pieces falling into place with a chilling clarity. He lured us into a false sense of security, to look away, to let down our guard. Elijah stood, his profile etched against the night, and we fell for it. But not again. This ends, but not on his terms, on ours. Our conversation deepened into the night, a symphony of strategy and determination. We would not be fooled again. The false hope he had offered would be his undoing, and the final horror of his grand design would be brought to light. As the first light of dawn peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets of Boston, I knew that the game had changed. The carver was close, his scent one of blood and terror, but now we were hunters, not the hunted. And though the gallows grew, so too did our endurance to see justice done. Chapter 14, The Unraveling Thread. The morning sun broke over the horizon with a reluctant crawl, as if even the celestial body itself bore hesitation at the prospect of the day's events in our troubled town. We found ourselves standing before a throng of townspeople, their faces a mosaic of rapt attention and thinly veiled dread. At the heart of it all was Arthur Wyland, the town's venerable vicar, his visage the very picture of bewilderment and indignation. "Surely you jest," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his years and the incredulity of the accusation laid bare before the public's eye. "I am a man of faith, a shepherd to this flock. To suggest my hand in such devilry is not only erroneous but blasphemous." Elijah stood beside me, a stalwart presence in the tempest of suspicion that churned around us. "We have evidence, Arthur. Your handkerchief, marked with the symbol, was found at the scene of the latest horror," he said, his words falling like hammer blows upon the anvil of silence that had settled over the square. The crowd erupted into a blare of gasps and murmured speculations, the divide between belief and skepticism as stark as the shadow and light that played upon the cobblestones. Absurdity, Arthur retorted, his voice rising in a crescendo of righteous fury. That token is not mine. It is a plant, a ruse designed to cast aspersions upon my character. I could feel the eyes of the townsfolk upon us, their gaze a palpable force that sought to pierce the veil of uncertainty that shrouded the vicar. And what of the testimonies? The witnesses who saw a figure matching your stature skulking near the docks on the night of the butcher's demise? I asked, my own voice steady despite the maelstrom of emotion that threatened to engulf us. Arthur's eyes met mine, and within their depths I glimpsed the tumult of a soul caught in the crossfire of accusation. I was attending to a sick parishioner, he said, his alibi delivered with a conviction that seemed to sway the hearts of some onlookers. The standoff was a tableau of tension, a moment suspended in time where the fate of a man teetered on the edge of a knife's blade. It was then that the silence was shattered, not by the vicar's protestations, but by the discovery that turned our certainty into ash. A child, no more than 10, emerged from the throng, his small hand extended. Within his palm lay the carver's token, a silver ring tarnished with the patina of wicked deeds. I found it, just there, he said, pointing to a spot not far from where we stood, where the real killer had made a silent escape amidst the theater of our confrontation. The revelation was like a cold wind that swept through the square, extinguishing the flames of fervor that had been ignited by the vicar's accusation. The crowd dispersed in a whisper of fabric and footfalls, leaving behind a residue of doubt and the lingering specter of the carver's presence. Elijah and I retreated to the dim interior of the local tavern, the usual hum of business muted by the day's events. We were so certain, Elijah said, his voice a low rumble of frustration. The evidence seemed irrefutable. I took a seat opposite him, the weight of our blunder heavy upon my shoulders. He's toying with us, Elijah. The vicar was but a pawn in his game, a distraction to further his true agenda. Our conversation wound its way through the labyrinth of our investigation, each turn leading us to a dead end that mirrored the hopelessness that had begun to seep into my bones. The false accusation had laid bare the true depths of the deception woven by the carver, a master of manipulation who had ensnared us all in his web of shadows. With each thread we pulled, the conglomerate he had crafted seemed to grow more complex, more impenetrable. As night descended upon Boston, I lay in the silence of my room above the bookstore, the events of the day replaying in my mind. The vicar's indignant proclamation of innocence, the child's discovery of the ring, the carver's silent escape, all served as a mocking chorus to the symphony of our failures. The thread we thought we had in hand had unraveled, leaving us grasping at the frayed ends of our wits and resolve. The killer remained a phantom, his specter a shroud over our town, and as sleep finally claimed me, I knew that the false hope we had been fed was but the prelude to a final horror yet to unfold. Chapter 15. Shadow's Grasp. I sat at my desk, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows across the walls, enveloping me in an eerie ballet of light and darkness. The books around me, once sources of comfort, now seemed to whisper secrets I could not decipher. Each creak of the wooden floorboards, each rustle of turning pages, sent my heart racing, a constant reminder of my vulnerability. Elijah had left earlier, his face etched with the strain of our fruitless search. His parting words, a promise to scour the town for any signs of the elusive specter we hunted. Alone, I pored over the ancient texts that littered the desk, searching for any clue that might illuminate the identity of the carver, whose grasp had tightened around the throat of our once peaceful town. The door to my shop creaked open, a slow, deliberate sound that caused my breath to catch in my throat. In the doorway stood a figure, cloaked in the darkness of the night, their features obscured by the wide brim of a weathered hat. "Evening, Miss Kimberly," came the voice, a deep, gravelly timbre that seemed to resonate with a familiarity that sent shivers down my spine. "Who's there?" I demanded, my hand inching towards the drawer where I kept my revolver, a cold comfort in the face of the unknown. "Just a weary traveler seeking refuge from the night's chill," the figure replied, stepping into the candlelight. It was Mr. Thompson, the fishmonger, his face an oddment of worry lines and salt-weathered skin. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my fingers relaxing away from the weapon. "You gave me quite a fright, Mr. Thompson," I said, attempting to steady my voice. "What brings you here at this hour?" His eyes, a murky green like the depths of the sea after a storm, held mine. I needed to talk, away from prying ears. "It's about the symbol, the one tied to the cult," he said, his words tumbling over one another like waves crashing upon the shore. We spoke at length, our conversation a meandering stream that flowed from suspicion to fear to the brink of understanding. Mr. Thompson spoke of strange gatherings in the dead of night, of figures cloaked, not just in garments but in secrecy, their intentions as obscure as the symbol that united them. As the candle burned low, casting our faces into a chiaroscuro of light and shadow, I shared my own findings, the connections I had drawn between the Carver's deeds and the dark rituals of old. "It's far from over, Miss Kimberly," Mr. Thompson said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to echo the dread that filled the room. "That symbol, it's a forewarning, mark my words. The grandfather clock struck 1, its chime a dirge that underscored the gravity of our discourse. We parted ways, Mr. Thompson disappearing into the mist that had begun to curl around the buildings outside, an ethereal serpent winding its way through the streets. I locked the door behind him, the click of the bolt a hollow sound in the vast silence of the night. It was then that I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned, my gaze sweeping over the shop, and that's when I saw it. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, a presence that was both there and not there, a wraith in the periphery of vision. Adrenaline surged through me, and I lunged for the revolver, but not before the shadow was upon me. The struggle was brief, but fierce, a dance with death that left me with wounds to bear and a life barely clung to. The carver's knife glinted in the dying candlelight, a specter's blade that sought my final breath. But as quickly as the assault began, it ended. The shadow vanished, leaving behind only the cold touch of fear and a silver ring that lay upon the floor, winking mockingly in the faint light. The town would wake to my screams, to a bookshop turned charnel house, and to the realization that the nightmare was far from over. The symbol tied to the cult resurfaced, and with it, the story we thought we knew unraveled, leaving us with frayed ends clutched in trembling hands. As dawn broke, painting the sky with the hues of bruised flesh, I knew that the carver remained a specter in our midst, a ghost in the mist whose grasp we had only narrowly escaped. And the symbol, that damnable mark of ancient evil, suggested a tale still unfolding, a horror still to be told. Chapter 16. The Legend Endures. The Boston Carver had become more than a man. He had become a legend, a whispered specter whose name caused shutters to be drawn and doors to be bolted as night's embrace settled upon the once bustling city. Elijah, whose injuries had healed into scars much like my own, joined me on the steps of the church, a building that now stood as a monument to the resolve of a battered community. "It's in the air, Kimberly," he said, his voice a reflection of the steel that lined his soul. "The fear, it's a part of us now." I turned to look at him, the stoic lines of his face telling a story of their own. "We can't let it define us, Elijah. We have to move forward, live our lives. We owe it to those we've lost." He nodded, a gesture of agreement and respect. "The town's different now. People look over their shoulders. They see shadows where there are none. The carver's done more than spill blood. He's woven himself into the fabric of our history." The market square, once a vibrant litter of trade and conversation, was quieter now. The vendors hawked their wares with subdued calls, their eyes wary and watchful. The townspeople shuffled past, their conversations a murmur of unease and resilience. Miss Peabody, the schoolmistress, approached us, her shawl wrapped tight against the bite of the wind. Kimberly, Elijah, she greeted, her smile a brave front against the shared trauma. The children, they're coping, but the tales, the carvers become a boogeyman in their stories. I offered her a reassuring nod. "We'll get past this, Miss Peabody. The carver may have eluded us, but he hasn't beaten us. We're stronger than he knows." We spoke at length, our words a scramble of hope and determination interwoven with the stark reality of our situation. The carver remained a mystery, a shadow that had slipped through our fingers, But we, the people of Boston, would not succumb to the darkness he had left in his wake. As night fell and the streets emptied, I found myself in my bookstore, the shelves lined with tales of horror that now seemed pale in comparison to our own. The scars I bore were not just physical, they were etched upon my very soul, but I was not broken. The symbol, that infernal eye within the thorns, still haunted my dreams, a puzzle begging to be solved. I pored over the books, the newspaper clippings, the police reports. The Carver had vanished, but I would not let the tale end without answers. My search continued, a solitary quest in the aftermath of the terror that had gripped our city. Elijah, ever the steadfast companion, supported my efforts, his own need for decisiveness as strong as my own. "We'll find him, Kimberly," he said one evening as we sat amidst the sea of documents that cluttered the shop. "Or we'll find the truth he's buried. Either way, this isn't over." The clock tower tolled, its bell a somber reminder of the passage of time, of lives lost and a future uncertain. The legend of the Boston Carver had been woven into the very heart of our city, a chilling legacy that would not soon be forgotten. But as the candlelight flickered and cast my shadow against the wall, I knew that the legend was not the end. It was a call to those of us left behind, a challenge to rise against the fear, to seek the light in the darkness. And so I continue, the unraveling thread of the Carver's dark litter in my hands, a symbol of the strength and agility of the human spirit. The story of the Boston Carver endures, but so too does our resolve to one day close the book on his reign of terror, with or without the final chapter written by his hand. Chapter 17, A Whisper in the Dark. Boston had donned its cloak of winter. The once vibrant foliage now succumbed to the frost's relentless march. The city, a crucible of history and modernity, had endured much, the weight of recent horrors etching deeper lines into its venerable face. In the aftermath of the Carver's reign, a hush had settled over the town, the kind that follows the fiercest of storms. The bookshop was a sanctuary of sorts, a repository of knowledge that had become my anchor in these tumultuous times. I, Kimberly, stood amidst the rows of books, the scent of aged paper mingling with the wood smoke that drifted from the hearth. My hands worked methodically, packing away the tomes that had been my companions through the darkest of days. Elijah, leaning against the counter with a thoughtful mien, broke the silence. "You're really leaving then? Off to seek a new horizon?" The question hung in the air, a specter of the decision that loomed over me. I thought I could, I admitted, my voice betraying a tremor of uncertainty. But this place, these events, they're a part of me now. Can I truly leave them behind? He pushed himself off the counter, his movements deliberate, the mark of a man who had faced down fear and emerged with a quiet strength. Sometimes, to move forward, we must accept the shadows of our past, not run from them. Our conversation wove through the evening, a litter of confessions and contemplations. We spoke of the Carver, of the wounds left in the wake of his terror, and of the durability of a city that refused to be defined by its darkest chapter. As I sealed the last box, the bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of Constable Harrow, his countenance grim. "Kimberly, Elijah, there's been another incident," he said, the words falling like stones into the well of silence. A chill ran down my spine, an echo of the fear that had gripped us all. "The same." I couldn't finish the question, the implications too horrifying to voice. Harrow nodded, his jaw set. "A crime that bears his signature. We thought the Carver's chapter had ended, but it seems the story is far from over." The news settled over us, a shroud that threatened to suffocate the hope we had clung to. The town's eerie calm shattered. The possibility that the cycle of violence might begin anew was a specter none dared to face. "I'll come with you," Elijah said, determination etched into his features. "We'll see this through, end it once and for all." I watched them depart, the night swallowing their silhouettes, and turned back to the task of packing. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. As I folded a stack of papers, a glint of metal caught my eye. There, half hidden beneath a ledger, lay a key, ornate and antiquated, its design unfamiliar. Curiosity piqued, I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was then I noticed the inscription, a series of symbols that mirrored those we had come to associate with the Carver. A clue, or perhaps a taunt, left in the very heart of my sanctuary. The revelation that the Carver's story and my own might continue sent a cascade of emotions through me. Fear, yes, but also a burgeoning resolve. I could not flee, not when the menace that had cast such a long shadow over our lives might still lurk among us. I placed the key in my pocket, its cool metal a reminder of the unfinished business that tethered me to Boston. The city had been scarred, but it endured, its people a record to the strength of the human spirit. As dawn approached, the first fingers of light creeping over the horizon, I knew that the legend of the Boston Carver would persist, woven into the fabric of the city's lore. But so too would the story of those who stood against him, who pursued greatness in the face of unspeakable evil. The bookshop door closed with a soft click behind me as I stepped into the new day, the key a weight in my pocket and a promise in my heart. The tale was not complete, the final breath not yet drawn, and I, Kimberly, would be there to chase the whisper in the dark, wherever it might lead. Our tale has reached its end. We're glad you were here for Gasp of the Final Breath. With StoryWave.ai, your prompts become unforgettable tales. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for daily explorations into storytelling. March 2024. Fare thee well.